Detective Mark Callaway narrowed his eyes as he analyzed the footage. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. Beside him, forensic expert Sarah Carter held her breath. On the screen, John Callaway was walking down the hallway of his home on the night of his disappearance. The problem? He had already been missing for 3 days. It was a cold night in El Dorado, a small town in Texas where the silence was almost absolute. The only thing breaking that stillness was the rhythmic flickering of the streetlights along the main road. No one could have imagined that, on that night, something would happen that would forever change the residents' perception of safety and reality. John Callaway was an ordinary man, the kind who always greeted his neighbors and took care of his garden. Until one day, he simply vanished. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no obvious clues. His car was in the garage, his wallet on the table, and his dinner in the microwave, as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The police were called, but they quickly realized this was no ordinary missing persons case. Sniffer dogs found no trace of him. Nearby security cameras showed no one leaving the house. It was as if John had evaporated. And then came the most disturbing detail. Some neighbors began reporting that, during the night, they saw flickering lights inside the house and shadows moving, but the house was completely empty. As days passed, a bizarre pattern began to emerge. Police reports showed that anonymous calls had been made from John's phone after his disappearance. The messages were short but unsettling. Some people received barely audible whispers over the phone, while others heard the heavy breathing of someone who never spoke a word. The town was in a panic. How could a man disappear without leaving a trace and yet still be present in some way? The mystery only deepened when detectives found a hidden detail in John's basement, something that would change the course of the investigation forever. Now, the question on everyone's mind: was this the work of someone extremely meticulous, or was there something beyond logic at play? El Dorado was never the kind of town that made headlines. Small, quiet, with well-kept streets and a community where everyone knew each other by name. But John Callaway's disappearance cast a shadow over the place, and as the days passed, the town's atmosphere began to shift. It wasn't just the fact that a man had vanished without explanation. There was something in the air, a silent unease that made residents lock their doors earlier, avoid going out alone at night, and glance over their shoulders as if they were being watched. The detectives started investigating John's past. At first, it seemed like a straightforward case, a citizen with no criminal record, no known enemies, no involvement in anything suspicious. But the more they dug, the more they realized his story wasn't so simple after all. There was one curious detail: John had no past before 1996. No birth certificate, no school records, no trace of his life before appearing in El Dorado. This was highly unusual. No one simply comes out of nowhere. Suspicions grew when they discovered that, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his basement, there was an old, locked trunk. When they finally managed to open it, what they found made the investigators' blood run cold: newspaper clippings from all over the country about strange disappearances. Names crossed out by hand, cryptic notes, and, at the bottom of the box, a passport with a completely different name. John Callaway was not John Callaway. Whether he had been running from someone or was himself responsible for something far greater, no one knew yet. But one thing was certain: the case had just become far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And as detectives tried to piece together this puzzle, new events began to haunt the town. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to prevent the truth from coming to light. The discovery of the trunk in John Callaway's basement turned the case from a simple disappearance into a national mystery. Detectives were no longer just investigating where he had gone, but who he really was and what those newspaper clippings meant. What once seemed like an ordinary life now unraveled into a labyrinth of false identities, erased traces, and unexplained connections to other missing persons cases across the United States. The first major breakthrough came when forensic experts analyzed the passport found in the trunk. Michael Duvall, that was the name on the passport, a man whose record was completely blank until 1996, the same year John appeared in El Dorado. Investigators dug deeper and discovered that Michael Duvall had been declared dead in New Orleans, in a fire that destroyed a small apartment. The charred remains of a body had been found at the scene, and the case had been closed as an accidental death. But if Michael Duvall was dead, then who was John Callaway? That question led the detectives to a second, even more disturbing discovery. The handwriting in the notes from the trunk was compared to old police records from New Orleans and matched that of a retired detective named Harlan Reeves. Reeves was known for investigating cases involving unexplained disappearances, but he had mysteriously vanished years earlier. Now, his notes were in the home of a man that no one could trace before 1996. As they tried to understand this connection, strange things began to happen. A week after the discovery of the trunk, the sheriff in charge of the case received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard nothing but heavy breathing, followed by a whisper, "You shouldn't have opened that box." The town of El Dorado was already on edge, but now even the investigators themselves began to wonder, what exactly were they dealing with? But the greatest shock was yet to come. What the detectives found in the last security recording from John's house would completely change the course of the investigation and reveal something no one could have predicted. The tension in El Dorado reached its peak when the detectives reviewed the security footage from John Callaway's house. Until then, it was believed that the residence had been empty since his disappearance. However, as they analyzed the recordings from the night after he went missing, a terrifying scene unfolded. At around 2:37 a.m., the house lights began to flicker for no apparent reason. Then, a dark figure appeared in the hallway, moving slowly, almost deliberately. The problem? The doors and windows were locked, and no signs of forced entry had been detected. Who, or what, was inside that house? The team enhanced the contrast on the footage and froze the image at the exact moment the figure passed by the hallway mirror. And that was when everyone in the room held their breath. The silhouette reflected in the mirror did not look like John Callaway, but it also did not resemble anyone the investigators knew. The face was distorted, the eyes were far too sunken. It looked human, but something was wrong. The most disturbing part was realizing that as the figure moved through the house, the time on the recording seemed to speed up and rewind erratically. As if the footage itself were being manipulated by something beyond logic. The next morning, one of the detectives found a brown envelope on his desk. No return address. Inside, there was only a single photograph, a close-up of the mirror in John's house. And beneath the image, a single handwritten phrase. He never left. El Dorado was no longer just facing a mysterious disappearance. Now, the investigation had transformed into something much bigger, something that could challenge everything the investigators believed to be real. The investigation into John Callaway quickly ceased to be an isolated case in El Dorado. The strangeness of the evidence, the disappearance without a trace, and the unsettling presence captured on the footage caught the attention of federal agents. Before long, the FBI took over the case, collecting all the evidence and imposing absolute secrecy over the investigation. What had once been a local mystery had now become a national security matter. The residents of El Dorado lived under the weight of rumors and theories. Some believed that John Callaway was part of a government experiment gone wrong, while others were convinced that something supernatural was involved. The only undeniable fact? No one ever found out where he went. And those who tried to dig too deep into the story suffered unexpected consequences. The detective who received the brown envelope requested a leave of absence just days later. He told his colleagues that he felt he was being watched, that shadows moved through his house at night. In one of his last interviews, he claimed to have received an anonymous phone call, where someone whispered, "You can disappear too." The commotion surrounding the case led to a change in federal investigation protocols for missing persons. El Dorado became a symbol of America's unsolved mysteries, a case where the evidence made no sense, a man vanished without explanation, and even investigators began to fear what they had uncovered. And then, one final detail emerged, perhaps the most terrifying of all. 3 years after John's disappearance, his house was demolished. Nothing should have remained there. But one night, A town resident passing by the site claimed to have seen a light flickering in what used to be the hallway of the house. This raised one last question, the most unsettling of all. Did John Callaway truly disappear, or is he still here, in a way we cannot comprehend? The case of John Callaway was officially closed. He remains missing, according to records. The federal reports on the investigation are classified, and any attempts to obtain information lead to evasive answers and closed doors. El Dorado, for its part, learned to live with the absence of answers. But if there's one thing those who live through this story know, it's that some mysteries never truly disappear. Years after John's disappearance, small pieces of evidence continued to emerge, as if the case refused to be forgotten. In 2011, an investigative journalist named Rebecca Holloway attempted to reopen the file. After months of interviewing residents and cross-referencing federal records, she received an email from an unknown sender with just one sentence: "Leave while you still can." 2 days later, Rebecca was in a suspicious car accident. She survived, but lost nearly all of her investigative notes. What was most intriguing was that, in her research, she uncovered a disturbing pattern. In at least 5 other U.S. states, cases similar to John Callaway's had occurred. People who appear out of nowhere, lived discreetly for a few years, and then vanished without a trace. Fake names, hidden pasts, newspaper clippings kept in secret. What were these people running from? Or, worse, what were they waiting for? The FBI refused to comment on the matter. But curiously, all the files related to these disappearances were moved to national security classification. This meant that only a limited number of people had access to this information. Why? What is the real secret behind these erased identities? The most chilling detail emerged in 2019 when a tourist passing through El Dorado decided to take a picture of the land where John Callaway's house once stood. When he reviewed the image on his phone, he saw something that should not have been there. Amid the tall grass and the remnants of concrete, there was an indistinct shadow, a dark silhouette, standing exactly where the hallway of the house used to be. The photo was never officially analyzed. But the oldest residents of El Dorado, those who still remember the story, say that if you pass by the site on a silent night, you may hear a low and constant noise. A repetitive sound, almost imperceptible. The sound of an old television, tuned to a static channel. And then comes the question that no one has ever been able to answer. Was John Callaway just an ordinary man who disappeared? Or had he never truly been here from the very beginning? Some stories don't need an ending to be terrifying. Some just continue, like a distant echo, waiting to be heard by those who dare to search for answers.